Hello, and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast in the dirt. I'm Craig Dalton, and I'm joined by my co-host, Randall Jacobs. Randall, how are you
Doing
today?
well, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy to see you. I feel like I've had pent-up conversations in my mind to have with you that I haven't been able to have. And gosh, I think it's been 4 or 5 weeks since we last recorded together.
It's been quite some time. I've been able to have some pretty enjoyable conversations myself, both with Monica Garrison on the last episode and Craig Calfee. So I've gotten my fill. But how about yourself?
Yeah, a couple good ones in the can already that we need to release. I've been talking to a lot of athletes lately just because it's the beginning of the season and I'm curious. A lot of new names coming to gravel. I'm just always curious how they're thinking about it. And actually, I've been extracting some really valuable bits of information in my mind for the mid-pack athlete like myself, just about how to kind of consider those long days in the saddle. And obviously, you're chasing wheels and how many candles to burn. All the types of things you need to be considering if you want to get to the end of one of these big long events.
Yep. I remember thinking in those terms very well. It's been some time since I've had that sort of fitness or competitiveness, but maybe at some point. It's cold here in New England. I'm not riding.
Fair enough. For me, it's always about just getting to the finish line. Like I know, like if I'm doing a 100-mile event, I'm not trying to win. Everybody knows I'm not winning races these days, but I'm always tempted to follow wheels. Mm-hmm. Particularly early on in these events, you just get your enthusiasm and adrenaline's going and you're just chasing things down, realizing like, even if you're just using perceived level of exertion, you're clearly building yourself a hole that you may not be able to come out of depending on how deep you go.
The last event that I really jumped into and took seriously, I recall like starting off and being like, all right, I'm just going to kind of hang. And then as people started going off the front, I drifted back a little bit. And about halfway through, I was feeling really good. And I saw people just exploding. And I was like, all right, well, I'm doing this race anyways. Why don't I race it? And I ended up doing really well in my amateur group. And so that's kind of my attitude of with regards to these events is if I'm going to be competitive, not have that be the primary goal, just like be at a pace early on where I could be competitive. And if I'm feeling good and other people seem to be falling off, well, all right, power ahead, get into the cave.
I think I've been doing it long enough that I've built a long endurance engine. And I know that as long as I keep it under control, I will end up picking people off down the line because I'm most of my training, I don't do a lot of high end stuff. I just build endurance, and maybe that's totally a flaw. Like I should be doing a little high end stuff just for versatility, but like I know I can keep plugging away all day.
Well, and as I talk about like having, you talk about having reserve and I would definitely start slow and barely finish if I were to jump into an event right now. So definitely need to get some more miles in.
Yeah, fair enough. Hey, the big thing I wanted to chat with you about, for Christmas, my wife generously bought me a Fit. Mm-hmm. And obviously I listened to your Bike Fit 101 episode with Patrick Carey, got a lot out of that. But it wasn't until getting into that room and having someone with lasers and measurement and a Fit Kit bike really dissect me, my body, my flexibility, that it all came together. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So what were the big takeaways? What changed?
Some of the stuff, like I know that as I've aged, I've lost flexibility. And so that was a big thing. And I can get into that a little bit as well. One of the most interesting things for me was, and you guys talked about this on Bike Fit 101, was just cleat positioning and foot positioning on the pedal. And the amount of time we spent kind of dialing that in. For me, it translated to my cleat was too far forward. So a little bit more on the, the front of my foot. And now I've moved back to the ball of the foot. And it's amazing. I mean, there's not much room for cleats to move, right? There's just, maybe 10 millimeters in there, but the movement that we did, that the cleat did move, I definitely feel like as I stand on the pedals, my foot is more squarely in the middle of the pedal.
Sure. Though, I mean, that 10 millimeters over a, 435 or so millimeter foot or whatever your foot length is substantial. Plus you have the two cleat positions. So it's probably more like 20 millimeters of total travel. Oftentimes you can't get them back far enough as we talked about in that episode. So But what did you notice? Like, did your pedal stroke become more comfortable? Did you, ceteris paribus, presumably you would be shifting your position on the bike more forward, like your saddle position would come forward?
Yep, just slightly forward. The way I can describe it, I just feel like I'm pushing down with a bigger part of my foot. And interestingly, he asked me, do you have wide feet? And I said, not to my knowledge. And he measured it and I was like, no, you have wide feet. And I think because I've been using the cleat position towards the toe, I wasn't really feeling any of that pressure in the shoes that I've been running. But now I definitely feel that pressure on the outside of the shoe.
Interesting.
Because of the way my foot is pressing on the pedal and where the pedal is kind of pushing that force back towards my foot.
Yeah, it's like the first and second knuckles on your metatarsals are kind of splaying out because that's where the force is being applied.
That's exactly it. So it felt fine. Like 10 days later, I rode 90 miles down to Santa Cruz one day and 90 miles back. So like the position worked. I think just interesting. And it's something I'm going to continue to observe and maybe have to get a wide shoe to feel a little bit more comfortable.
Potentially a wide shoe. Another thing, and it may or may not be appropriate in your situation, it's not something you would add to deal with a shoe that's too narrow. But in my case, I had some pressure on the inside of my foot too, like on the big knuckle, particularly my right big toe. And I got little footbeds that had kind of a button underneath I think the second knuckle inward, and that really helped to fix that. And it would also reduce the amount of splay in one's foot too. So if you have any sort of pressure distribution issues laterally across your foot, you might experiment with footbeds first.
Yeah, and great point. And something I just totally blanked on was that I did end up getting like a footbed in my shoe as well. There you go. Yeah, so a lot of changes down on the feet. I don't want to get too far into this, but we brought up crank length. And 100% I want to move down. Like it's just a matter of acquiring another crank to move me from 172.5 to 170 on the fit bike. Like I couldn't really notice that much of a difference, but I know from talking to you and talking to Andrew, my fitter, like the benefits of going to that smaller crank size are going to make sense for me.
Well, and I was initially when you and I spoke, just based on your height, I don't think at the time I had any other measurements from you. I had recommended 165s, and you're actually quite a leggy guy. You're running a 768 millimeter saddle height with that 172.5 crank. So presumably dropping to 170s, you might even bump up a millimeter or two. So you and I are running essentially the same saddle height, and I'm a smidge under 5'11". I think you're a smidge under 5'10", right? Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And these are things that became highlighted. And things that I sort of intuitively knew, like I would always tell people when fitting a bike, I'm leggy and short torso. And historically, I've always had to have a shorter stem than my peers at the same height to try to get that fit correctly. But it's so fascinating. Like I'm just not a super detail oriented person. So to have Andrew just measure everything to the millimeter and force these discussions has been really interesting. Yeah. So again, started at the feet, bought into the crank length reduction for sure. Otherwise, the bike fits me pretty well, which is interesting. But the one area that was highlighted, and it's something I've known, maybe it's partly due to having some back problems, partly due to like not being super flexible, has been the drop from the highest point of the saddle to the bar center. And the first thing that he said was, you've got the drop as if you're a Tour de France pro racer.
Yeah. And I recognize, so you're on a medium. I ride a large. You have a thesis as well. And, I used to have a medium and I had that set up pretty aggressively with like a 110 stem. And, you with that saddle height, you'd have to have your stem flipped and, all the spaces underneath to get a higher handlebar position, but it's still, proportionally you have the legs of someone who's more like 6 foot, but you have the torso of someone who's maybe 5'8", 5'9". And so that combination means that you either have a large with a short stem, which isn't as great for for road because your front end's not planted enough. You don't have enough mass cantilevered over the front axle, or you have a medium where we can get that, but you might not be able to get the height without, say, a 17-degree stem flipped upward to get that rise, which is a way that you could solve for that, but not with a shock stop stem, which you also like to run because they don't offer that option.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember that conversation when I was first getting the thesis about, you said very specifically, and I remember you could go with a medium or a large. And I've always been the type of rider, and I think this goes back to my like early mountain bike roots, to like a smaller frame size. I just find them to be more nimble, and that's what I'm drawn towards. But these fit issues and challenges I'm having is definitely making me rethink that. And, you know, being a part of this podcast and this community, I've obviously have met with tons of frame builders along the way. And I'm thinking I would love to explore what a custom fit bike would look like for me, because I pour through geometrygeeks.bike constantly when I'm talking to new guests who are bike manufacturers. And I just don't find bikes that line up to my unique leggy, short torso body type.
Well, and in fact, I believe that the trend will continue towards even taller stack heights proportionally for a given reach on bikes, which is to say your medium, you know, the next generation thesis, which is a ways off, like it's on the drawing board now. There's no CAD file. Don't get too excited. But that bike will have a proportionally taller head tube. And so it would be able to accommodate what you're describing. And you can still get the lower position with a negative 17 stem. And I think that'll be that is a general trend. And that will continue. But when you can go full custom, there's a lot you can play around with. And you actually had some help from a custom builder kind of proposing geometry that you've sent over to me. And I threw it into Bike Geocalc, which is available at...
Yeah, what's that all about?
Yeah, so this tool, I've been using it for quite some time. It's bikegeocalc.com. And this tool allows you to essentially take the geometry of any bike, throw it up in the tool, and then tweak it, play around with it, put your own fit parameters in there so you can actually see your points in space grafted onto a particular bike. Or in this case, we built up a custom bike and then are able to have it shadow and toggle between your current thesis and how that's set up and how this new bike is set up. So you can, visually see this comparison and see, the various parameters and how they relate to each other. Everything from bottom bracket height to where the points in space are, toe overlap issues, all this stuff kind of surfaces when you actually see it visually. So it's an awesome tool. I love this tool.
It's incredible because I wasn't aware of this yet. And on geometrygeek.bike, you can just see the numbers. And so you can compare one bike to another, which is super useful. You can compare 5 bikes. So that's super interesting. And that was I feel like the first step of my journey in understanding fit a little bit better. But this site that you just shared with me, and I'll share it in the show notes if I didn't say that already, super interesting to be able to toggle between the two bikes and see how does it lift your bars? How does it lift the top tube and stand over height? Like all those things become immediately apparent. And I have to say, when I look at the shadow bike design you created for me of the new frame, and I see that the handlebars go up that 40 millimeters that I desperately need to achieve to add to that, I'm like, oh, my back would feel so good with that.
Well, and the designers of this, who I've reached out to in the past, they made a smart decision of centering everything around the bottom bracket spindle, which I've said many times before, that is the foundation of bike fit. And so you can see kind of the bike is, well, let's just get right into it. So talk about some of the parameters that you're hoping for in addition to fit with this, potential new bike. And let's talk about whether or not all these goals can be achieved together or whether there's some things that you have to balance.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely love the fact that my thesis feels like a great road bike and a great capable off-road bike. And when I say things about this new custom bike, it's really challenging what I want the bike to do, because I'll say something and then you'll remind me of the net effect of that decision. So like in my mind, I say like, oh, I want a bike that can run 700 by 50s.
Yeah.
In the off chance that I do a bike packing trip or something. And then we talk about things like, okay, what does the chainstay length need to be in order to achieve that? What does the fork need to look like in order to achieve that? And all of a sudden it has me questioning, because I don't sit here thinking that 700 by 50 is like my daily wheel set size that I need to rock all the time. It's more of a theoretical desire of that once a year bike packing trip that I might do, that I was like, oh, it'd be great to have that kind of accommodation. But so can you like walk me through, like if I did go that size and everything needs to be lengthened out, how does the characteristics of the bike change at that point?
Well, they change in a bunch of different ways. So first off, like wheelbase has to increase, right? So let's say you keep the crank constant, right? Well, and you're starting with a bike that has relatively short chainstays. The thesis is 420, which is on the short end of the gravel spectrum. Like that's the long end of the endurance road spectrum, short end of the gravel spectrum. So we're looking at other bikes. I think the Cervelo Aspero, which is another one of these kind of one bikes, also has 420 chainstays. So, if you want to accommodate a bigger tire, well, you need to lengthen the chainstays, because otherwise that tire is going to cut into the seat tube. And you could design a seat tube that has a cutout, but then you might not be able to get a dropper post in, right? So, there's these compromises. Additionally, if you're working with metal, so you're talking going full custom, well, with metal, you need even longer chainstays because you can't get the shaping that you can get with carbon or with an advanced hydroforming and welding process like you have on, say, a specialized smart weld aluminum bike, where they're able to do some carbon-like shaping. But for the most part, like carbon allows you to make the tightest possible package because you can shape it any sort of way. Metal, you're much more constrained.
Yeah, that makes sense. And part of this discussion, and I didn't specify this earlier, is I think I do recognize that 90+% of my riding is going to be off-road. So having a bike that is more off-road than road makes sense for me at this point.
Well, and so we've talked about the back end in a general way, right? And this would apply to a bike of any size, right? Because, the chainstays need to be what they are to accommodate the tire, not the rider. Up front, it has to accommodate the rider because you have a reach number, which scales with the rider size and the bike size. So reach being the horizontal measurement from the center of the bottom bracket to the center of the upper headset bearing, right? So that, stack and reach being the two figures that are most useful in comparing bikes. And so if I want to put a bigger tire on, well, I have to move that front axle out somehow, or I need to move that pedal spindle that, in its most forward position, I need to move that in somehow. And, crank length should be set proportionally. So if you're a smaller rider, fortunately, you need proportionally shorter cranks. So you're going down to 170. So you get 2.5 millimeters right there. So ceteris paribus, you get 2.5 more millimeters more length. If the front axle is in the same position, well, you're going from a maximum, say, right now, I think you run, 700 by 30 on the road, 650 by 47. Those are approximately the same radius. If you run 700 by 40, it adds 10 millimeters. If you go 700 by 45, that's another, 15 millimeters relative to 650B by 47. So to get, and actually 650Bs, it's a couple millimeters smaller than the 700 by 28 by 30. So essentially, to go from 650B by 47 to 700 by 47, same volume but in a bigger radius, you have to add 18 or 19 millimeters of radius from the center of the axle to the outside of the tire, and that is where toe overlap becomes an issue, especially on as you get smaller in the size range for bikes. So how do you address that? Right. Well, you go with you make the bike longer, you extend the reach, right? So then same head tube, same fork offset, everything, you just push that out. Well, that's one way to do it. And that's how a lot of bikes have gone in the gravel only space. And it's definitely the direction that mountain bikes have gone in. Like that's been the philosophy.
And is that stretching the length of the top
so
tube?
longer top tube, longer effective top tube, and longer reach. So it's the reach number that's increasing and the top tube with it. And that, as a consequence, to get the handlebar in the hoods, your touch point in the same position, you have to get a shorter stem. All right. So that
right. And you see that quite often. Like if you look at a lot of bikes that are spec now, they are going, as you said, to the direction of the way mountain bikes went. Just a lot shorter stems coming into play.
And if you're looking at a de facto drop bar mountain bike or a pure adventure bike, that's a fine way to go. But if you want a one bike, it's taking you away from that because you won't have enough mass cantilevered over the front axle. So the next thing that we can play with, and all of these, there are second order effects with these things that you change, right? So the simplest one, make the bike longer with a shorter stem. Next one we can do is have a more slacked out head angle, right? So you go from 72 degree head angle to 71.5 or 71. Usually at these head angles, wheel flop and so on really isn't an issue. That's more when you get into like mountain bikes with 65 degree head angles. Wheel flop being the bike, as you turn the wheel, the front end will actually drop a little bit. So the bike has a tendency to want to flop over and potentially pitch you over the bars in certain situations if it's not slacked out right. And so that slows the steering, and it further pushes out that front axle such that you have less mass cantilevered over the front axle for planting the front end, which is the case with everything you can do. The whole point is to get the front axle further away from your pedals so you don't have toe overlap. And so everything you do means you're millimeter for millimeter having less mass over that front axle for road handling, cornering, descending. How are we so
but if
far?
we talk about, I'm understanding what you're saying, but let's talk about as this bike's going to have an off-road orientation, do there then become benefits in the off-road handling by having that additional length or having a slacker head tube?
So there can be. There are a few different. So the things that you would be wanting off-road is, well, you want your mass actually more over the rear, so your front wheel can roll and sail over terrain. And without, take a dropper post out of the equation for a moment. The further forward the front axle is, the more mass is going to be distributed over the rear axle. Right. So it would have that benefit. And then, the next thing we're looking at is, your trail figure. And trail can be tricky for people to understand, but a simple way to think of it is, if you're familiar with like a caster, right? So like wheels that are on there's a vertical axis around which, the wheels can kind of pivot around, and the caster wheels trail behind the desk or the chair, the office chair that they're attached to, right? So
yeah,
it's basically that contact point of the caster wheel on the ground is trailing behind the axis around which the caster can rotate, right? So trail is essentially is that. So a fast handling bike will have a lower trail, less caster effect, and less propensity to go in a straight line, and a bike that's more stability oriented will have more trail, more caster effect, and more propensity to go in a straight line.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, unlike a mountain bike, which oftentimes it needs to be nimble to get around corners and things like that, with the gravel bike, I'm not necessarily on a lot of tight switchbacks and things like that. It's a lot more open fire roads. It seems to me that kind of a little bit slacked out is okay for the type of riding I'm doing.
Yeah, though on the mountainside, even really like pure cross-country oriented mountain bikes have slacker head tube angles than even some of the slackest gravel bikes. Yeah,
for sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I would never want this bike to completely forego like it being fun on the road, because that is going to be a component of how I ride it. But I think in this conversation, it's pushing me towards, I don't need to have 700 by 50. So if I took that down to 700 by 45, for example, and the 650B wheel set is going to be the one that I would ride the sort of highest volume tire on, Where do you think that gets me on the 650? Does that get me out to 650 by 50?
Well, so the limiter on your 650B wheel set is not going to be radius, because that 650 by 50 is going to be much smaller. That's equivalent to a 700 by 33, 34. So radius is not your limiter there. Your limiter is tire width, and especially whether the chainstays can be designed in a way that will clear that bigger width, given that it also has to contend with the chainring also interfering in that area.
Yeah. Gotcha. So is that where like oftentimes the solution is a drop stay?
Yes. So that's the whole reason for the existence of the drop chainstay. And so you can get to 2.1, 2.25 or so with a single drop stay. And then you see bikes like the Open Wide, Gerard Vrooman's bike, that have a double drop stay to fit 2.4 while not, increasing Q factor. Because the other thing you could do is like a fat bike is just like keep increasing the Q factor of your cranks, which is the distance between where, the two places where the pedals thread into. Just make that wider and wider and you'll be able to fit a bigger tire in the back. But you're not going to be able to pedal smoothly. So these are all the constraints that we have to balance. So 2.4 is really kind of the biggest. It's the biggest tire that I would ever design a bike to accommodate that could still be a road bike because of the Q factor issue.
Yeah. I feel like I would be totally happy at 650 by 2.1 or 2.2.
Well, and this goes to, if you want even more capability, you could always go mullet with a 2.4 up front and a 2.1 or 2.2, 2.25 in the rear.
I do love that idea, and I'm totally supportive of it. What is the effect of that? Like, if you have that bigger tire up front, is that slackening the bike out? Because
it is effectively slackening the bike out. Trivially, it's not a huge amount, so your front end will rise ever so slightly, which is something you would want to happen anyways if you're riding more technical terrain. But we're talking millimeters here. To really make a big impact, you need a flip chip, which we'll get to in a moment. But what's nice about that sort of setup is most of your mass, no matter what, is going to be over the front axle, which means on the rear tire. Over the rear axle, which means over the rear tire. And so you can go with a small knob or file tread or even a semi-slick in the rear that is 2.1 or 2.2, and then go with a knobby up front. And the knobby is going to roll more slowly, but there's less mass on it, so the impact is going to be less. So that higher volume knobbier front is going to have less impact than that same tire in the rear in terms of your rolling resistance, which makes it nice for, say, all the different types of terrain that you'll be tackling, including the roads between.
And I'm super jazzed about the idea of having that additional suspension in the higher volume tire up front, because I feel like, a lot of times the limiting factor in my terrain here is that I'm just getting abused in my upper body from, the what I'm feeling through the handlebars.
Well, so then let's say that we wanted to try to, make this as much of an adventure, trail sled as possible, while at the same time maintaining to the full degree possible the road experience. Well, this is where we get into adjustable geometry. Now, I think the most important consideration for adjustable geometry is really the front. That's where you get the biggest change. You can you change the heights of the front end by 10 millimeters, and the offset by 3-4 millimeters in the process with certain forks, like the NV Adventure fork that you and I had talked about. There's a couple other forks that are designed according to that same philosophy, and that it drops the front end, it quickens or slows down the steering, and combined with an off-road setup where you run a bigger tire up front, you're getting the extra height of the tire, you're getting the extra height from the axle being positioned further out on the fork, so bigger axle to crown.
From the flip. From the flip in off-road mode, you're going up.
In off-road mode, in the flip, you would be going out, away. So you're extending the length of the fork, which is bringing the front end up. And it's also slackening things out. And, in a bike with the same tire size and the same head tube angle, if that was not varying and you increase the fork offset, you would be decreasing the trail. So it would be quickening the steering. But because you're slackening the head angle and increasing the tire radius at the same time, the net change in caster ends up being nothing, or you end up increasing that trail figure, that caster effect. So that it's actually a great way to do it.
Every time we've talked about flip chips, I'm there with you. Like, it just seems it gives designers and riders, in terms of altering the performance of their bike, just a bigger range of options to lean into road mode versus off-road mode.
And the way to do a flip chip, in my opinion, is have the flip chip move the axle up and inward perpendicular to the caliper, and then you run a 180 caliper in dirt mode when it's extended out, and then you run a 180 rotor in dirt mode and a 160 rotor in road mode. And in that way, your two wheel sets have the rotor size that is appropriate for that experience, and you don't have to move the caliper, which is a real pain in the butt when swapping wheel sets. So this can be like a hot swap. You just flip, remove the wheel, flip the chip. Maybe you have to adjust the position slightly of the caliper, but you don't have to unbolt it and put on some adapter and all this other stuff with some designs that I think is just a non-starter.
Yeah, I haven't looked into the details of that NV fork to see if that would be required, the movement of the caliper.
It's not. You can run and so that they've done it the way that I would do it. There's another company, 8 Bar, that has a bike that's done it the way that I would do it. I might do a couple of things. We'll see that when a year out from now when I'm able to introduce that. But in general, that's the way I think a flip chip fork should be done for a gravel bike.
And do you think on that NV fork you use two different size rotors, or are you on the same size?
I believe you can use two different size rotors. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Super interesting. Well, man, I mean, this has been super helpful, and I imagined it would be. And seeing that bike geometry calculator, super cool, and understanding these trade-offs. And I think this is really helpful, like freeing the designer to say, if I say 700 by 50, let's talk about 700 by 50 on the front wheel only, and not try to accommodate that on the rear wheel, so we don't have to bring the stays out so far.
I mean, you could go moto style and have a 700 front and a 650 rear.
The old Trek 69er.
Yeah, though it actually, for bicycles versus motorbikes, it doesn't make as much sense, because on a motorbike you have all the power coming out of the motor, versus if you run a big, high volume 650 in the rear and a skinnier, lower volume 700 in the front, you're losing this suspension effect up front and you're gaining rolling resistance in the rear. So it's the exact opposite of what you would want. So it makes less sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would run the same size wheels whenever I'm running it, but it does sound like, if I made that requirement in the rear, and I'd love to get your advice on this, is 700 by 45 enough of accommodation to kind of bring that chainstay length in, or do I need to say 700 by 40 is the max that I would run in the rear?
Yeah, and that will depend on on the limitations of whomever is fabricating your frame. So if they're working in carbon with full freedom in terms of how that form takes shape, and they're doing, volume runs, then that's one set of constraints. If it's a guy or gal in their garage working with titanium and bending tubes in a vise, that's a different set of constraints, and you need to have a longer chainstay just because of the way that things have to be fabricated. So that's something we can play with. And when we put the Bike Geocalc tool in the show notes, it will be the link to Craig's specific, the bike that he's considering building now as of this conversation, and his current thesis. And in a future episode, we'll post what he ultimately ends up with if he decides to do a custom bike. So if you want to contribute to the conversation, take a look in the show notes at what Craig currently has up there, and jump into the ridership, the Gravel Ride podcast channel, and provide some feedback on how you think this thing should be built.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Thanks, Randall. That's going to do it for this week. As Randall just said, if you have any commentary on this, and I would love to get people's feedback, Please join us in the ridership. Just visit www.theridership.com. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/thegravelride. There's a couple different membership options or one-time contributions. Everything is vastly appreciated by both of us. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.